Welcome back to our second lecture on Australia and New Zealand. In this one, we're going to be talking about historical geography and settlement in Australia and New Zealand. So the first people to come to Australia came from Southeast Asia and originally, of course, from Africa, and they were the Aboriginals. And they came on watercraft and low sea levels during a glacial age. But what's really fascinating is that they came over 60,000 years ago. In North America, we think of the indigenous populations coming about 20, 25,000 years ago, but this is 60,000 years ago. And we'll talk more about them at the end of this one, end of the class, and also your video is going to be about Aboriginal populations. So they're mostly hunters and gatherers, but they also settled in areas and had different clan relationships amongst themselves. Now, in terms of Europeans coming across, we're going to talk about this in more detail, but we often think that James Cook was the first person in the 1770s to come and see New Zealand as well as Australia. He's the first person to come and make kind of a meaningful exploration of this area, but there were some others that actually happened before, but without any meaningful settlements or anything like that. So that was kind of a question. Who were the first Europeans to reach Australia? In the 1606, the Dutch, which were in Indonesia at the time, just across the strait, they landed on Cape York Peninsula, and had a little interaction with the Aboriginal populations, but nothing came of that. Around 1642, as well as another trip in 1644, Abel Tasman visits, I say visits Tasmania and New Zealand. And you can see on this, the bottom one is the red one, the first one. And what the Dutch would often do is they would come down and catch the roaring 40s and wind patterns, the westerlies, and then take them over, and then they would cut up to Indonesia. But he decided not to, and he kept going, and he ran into Tasmania, and that's named after him as Tasman. He never landed, though. He then went to New Zealand and had an unfortunate incident with the Maori people, the indigenous populations of New Zealand, and 4 of his people were killed, so he never actually then landed. He sailed his way back up, and then a further one, he actually explored the north coast of Australia, but again, never landed. Nothing meaningful came of those explorations. But the most meaningful one was James Cook from England. In 1770, he explored the east coast and saw a place called Botany Bay, just because of the unique botany that they had there. And here shows a bunch of his journeys, but the most important one, of course, is in the red. His first one where he went to New Zealand, came up and explored the east coast of Australia. He's also the person that, in a way, ran across the Sandwich Islands, which became Hawaii. And he actually died there as the indigenous populations rose up against him. Here's just a painting of them landing at Botany Bay and hoisting the English flag up and claiming this area for England. So the English, the first settlement that they created was in 1788. And about 1,000 people arrived to Botany Bay, but it wasn't really ideal, so they ended up moving to Sydney Bay down the coast. And these were mostly convicts, as we'll talk about in a moment. In 1813, they started crossing the Blue Mountains, that's the Great Dividing Range, to see what was on the interior. So they were really stuck on that eastern coast. In 1829, Perth, which is on the western coast, was founded. And the first settlers that came over were convicts. So if you look at the time frame and think about U.S. history, prior to the independence, the U.S. independence, the Revolutionary War, England sent a lot of their convicts to the U.S., to the colonies, the American colonies, I should say. But that kind of ended once we became an independent country. And so then they turned around and said, oh, we just discovered this place, Australia. And so they emptied out their prisons and they put their convicts on the ones to go there. So we share a history with Australia, as some of our first settlers were actually convicts. 1793, so about 5 years later, the first free settlers came. And they often focus on the southern coast around a town called Adelaide. And most of the people at this time period were British and Irish settlers that were brought over. A little bit later, Germans started to migrate. Just as they came to the United States, they also went to Australia. The nice thing about them is they actually brought wine and vines to start the wine industry around Adelaide in the southern part. And then the Italians came a little bit later and again also brought more wine. So Australia is known for a lot of its wine production, and it comes back from this European migration. Now, in 1851, just after, we think about the 49ers, not just the football team in San Francisco, but the gold rush here in California, where people rushed there. A person that went to New South Wales in Australia found gold in New South Wales and then later in Victoria. And so they actually had their own gold rush as well in Australia, just a few years after we had ours here in California. And people came from all around the world. 40,000 Chinese came during that gold rush. And it's similar to what happened here in California. It's kind of very similar. But again, they had, just as we did here in California, a cultural backlash. And so they started restricting Chinese migration in 1887. And in 1901, Australia became independent. And at that point, they created a new policy, a migration policy, which was with a white Australian policy. So only white people could actually migrate to Australia. This lasted all the way until the 1970s. Now, the impact on Aboriginal populations is a similar story that we've heard elsewhere. Disease, warfare, and taking of lands led to basically a genocide. In 1830, all of them in Tasmania were rounded up and herded into reserves, very similar to our history, of course. Then there was a massacre of Aboriginals by settlers in 1838. And in 1897, Queensland, they passed the Protection Act where any Aboriginal could be declared a ward of the state and sent to reserves, which separated them from their place, their clan, their languages, etc. Now, you guys are going to be watching a video about this rabbit-proof fence that really relates to all of these topics about the impact on Aboriginal populations. So the migration policy, as I said, the white policy. So only people that were considered white were allowed to migrate into Australia. And that did not end until 1973. The Vietnam War also led to a lot of Vietnamese refugees, not only coming to the United States, but also places like Australia. And that's led to very strong communities, as well as more recently, Cambodian agricultural workers. Because of course they had their problems, as we talked about in terms of the 1970s with Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. And so a lot of people fled. And so you actually have a lot of agricultural workers, especially in the wine industry in Australia. From about 2000 on, we saw a lot more migration coming from places in Asia in general. Southeast Asia, quite a bit. I mentioned the Cambodians as well as the Vietnamese. We've seen an increase in people coming from India to Australia for opportunities, also from China. And Australia is, geographically proximate to these parts of Asia, so it's a lot easier. And then they also have been receiving refugees from places like the Middle East, like Syria and others, Iraq, and also from Africa, from places like the Sudan, which is going through a lot of difficulties and civil wars, as well as South Africa. And today, 30% of the population of Australia is foreign born, which is the highest percent of all Western countries. In the US, we're about 11% of our population is foreign born. So here's just a difference from 2001 to 2016 of the percent of people born in Europe versus those born elsewhere. And you can see in 2001, it was mostly people born in Europe that were migrating, and that has steadily declined as people that are migrating to Australia from other parts of the world has been increasing. Next lecture, we'll be talking about some much more about current populations, economics, and then indigenous issues about the Aboriginal populations.